good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our Author Meets Critiques Roundtable panel discussion hosted by the Center for Empowering Victims of Gender-Based Violence. And also we want to thank the publisher, the Routledge, Taylor and Francis Group for their publicizing the event via their social media outlets. And then thank you for the participants today joining our Zoom meeting. I will be the moderator for today's panel discussion. My name is Ziwei Qi. I am an assistant professor of criminal justice at Fort Hays State University. And I am also the co-founder and the director of the center. Today's Author Meets Critique series is one of the many roundtable series hosted by the center this year. The center really dedicates a platform for rural scholars engaging in conversations and showed off your research about gender-based violence in rural communities. So if you would like to follow us for more series like this, please make sure to follow our website as I type in the chat box. And also, if you like us to host an event for you, please reach out to me at my email address or Dr. April Terry, the Senior Research Consultant at the Center. I will be introducing our panelists momentarily, but before that, I do respectfully asking the participants, if you're not a speaker, please mute your audio during the panel discussion. The entire panel discussion will be recorded and it will be uploaded on our website. So please make sure to rewatch and share with your colleagues and your students. I will start with the overall review of the panel discussion, the timeline, and then introduce our panelists today. Today's panel discussion will last about 2 hours. We will have about 10 to 15 minutes to introduce all the panelists. Immediately after, the author, Dr. DeKaristy, going to give a brief introduction of his book, Women Abuse in Rural Places. Immediately after, our panelists are going to provide critiques and feedbacks about 10 to 12 minutes each. The author do have about 10 to 12 minutes to provide your response. And in the end, the discussion will be open for all the participants today. If you do have questions, please make sure to type in your question in the chat box. And if you would like to purchase Dr. DeKaristy's book, we also provide a link to the publisher as well. First of all, I would like to introduce our author, Dr. Walter DeKaristy. Dr. Walter DeKaristy is the Anna Dane Carlson Endowed Chair of Social Science, Director of the Research Center on Violence, and Professor of Sociology at the West Virginia University. He has published 25 books, 100 scientific journal articles, and 83 scholarly book chapters on violence against the women and other social problems. In 2008, the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma gave him the Linda Salzman Memorial Intimate Partner Violence Research Award. He also jointly received the 2004 Distinguished Scholar Award from the American Society of Criminology Division on Women and Crime, and 2007 inaugural UOIT Research Excellence Award. In 1995, he received the Critical Criminologist of the Year Award from the ASC Division on Critical Criminology, and in 2008, the DCC gave him the Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2014, he received the Critical Criminal Justice Scholar Award from the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, section on Critical Criminal Justice. And in 2015, he received the Career Achievement Award from the ASC's Division on Victimology. In 2017, he received Impact Award from the ACJS section on Victimology and the Robert Jerry Book Award from the ASC's Division on Victimology. Next, I'm going to introduce our panelists, the critiques today. Our first panelist is Dr. James Potacek. Professor James Potacek has been working on the problem of violence against women since 1981. He has been a batter's counselor and has conducted training on domestic violence intervention for hospital, mental health, and criminal justice professionals. He has done research on men who batter, on rape and battering on college campuses, and on battered women's experience with the courts. His 2010 edited book, Restorative Justice and Violence Against the Women, explores new and controversial ways that communities are responding to violence in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. His current research examined the class dimension of intimate violence. In his teaching, he brings victim advocates and community anti-violence workers into his classes to show students the kind of career paths that are available to them. Dr. Sandra Wacklade. Dr. Sandra Wacklade is currently conjoined professor of criminology and a member of the Gender and Family Violence Research Group. In January 2026, she joined the Liverpool University, having held previous appointments at Manchester Metropolitan, Keele, Salford, and Liverpool Polytechnic, where she began her career in January 1975. Throughout her career, she has maintained an interest in criminal victimization that in more recent times has been extended both substantially and conceptually to include impact of new terrorism and war. Her most recent work has extended this interest in war through a critical engagement with criminological understanding of war and its consequences through a gendered lens. Next is Dr. Kelly Renneson. Dr. Renneson is a professor and former associate dean of faculty affairs at the University of Colorado, Denver School of Public Affairs. She also served as director of the Office of Equity and the Title IX coordinator for the CU Denver and Auschwitz medical campuses. She earned her PhD in 1997 in political science from the University of Houston, University Park, where she also received a BS in psychology, MA in sociology, and MA in political science. In 2016, she was awarded the Bonnie S. Fisher Victimology Career Award from Division of Victimology in the American Society of Criminology. She has also served on the National Academy's committee examining domestic sex trafficking of minors in the United States and was a senior researcher at the Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Statistics. Her research focused on the nature, extent, and the consequences of violent victimization, with an emphasis on research methodology, quantitative analyses, measurement, and crime data. Her research has appeared in many venues, including the Journal of Quantitative Criminology, Justice Quarterly, Violence and Victims, and Violence Against the Women. She has authored several books, including Introduction to Criminal Justice, Systems, Diversity, and Changes, the Wiley Handbook on the Psychology of Violence, Research Methods in Criminal Justice and Criminology, and International Handbook of Violence Studies. She published Women Leading Change in Academia, Breaking the Glass Cliff, Sealing the Slipper, with co-editor Dr. Amy Bernami of Michigan State University. Our next panelist is Dr. Sarah Wendt. Dr. Sarah Wendt has a PhD from the University of South Australia and has taught in social work for over a decade. Prior to academia, Sarah practiced in the field of domestic violence. She has published on violence against the women and the social work practice. Her current research projects explored impact of domestic violence on women's citizenship, service provision for Aboriginal communities experiencing family violence, and engaging men to address domestic violence. In particular, Dr. Wendt has been researching rural women's experiences of domestic violence for over a decade in Australia, and more recently, how domestic violence work shapes practitioners living and working in rural communities. And finally, we have Dr. Claire Rezende. Dr. Rezende currently serves as the Judy Conway Pattern Endowed Chair in the Center for Research on Violence Against the Women. She also serves as professor and chair in the Department of Sociology, College of Arts and Science. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Delaware. Dr. Rezende is an internationally recognized scholar on gender and crime issues. Her research and community engagement have received regional and national recognition, most recently by the Women and Crime Division at American Society of Criminology, from whom she received the Saltzman Award for contributions to practice, an award that recognizes a criminologist whose professional accomplishments have increased the quality of justice and the level of safety for women. Much of Dr. Rezente's research has focused on the violent victimization experiences of socially and economically marginalized groups of women, including women living in poverty and the women in same-sex intimate partnerships. Her current research focuses on human trafficking, particularly domestic sex trafficking, as well as services for trafficking victims. She also examined effects of religiosity and religious self-regulation on intimate partner violence, perpetration, and victimization. Additionally, she evaluates the potential benefits of the therapeutic horticultural program for residents of a battered women's shelter. Now, after our introduction of panelists, we'll start with our author, Dr. Kersty, to provide a brief introduction of his book, Woman Abuse in Rural Places.
Oh, thank you. First, I hate to sound like an Academy Award recipient, but I must give thanks to a number of people. First of all, to you, Ziwi, for your time and effort and energy. Thank you so much for organizing this. It's an honor to be here. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Callie Renison and Molly Dragowitz, who have traveled with me down a long path of research in the field of violence against women in rural and remote places. And I deeply appreciate working with them and the insight I've gained from them. We published a number of pieces based on secondary analyses of the National Crime Victimization Survey data, which the findings are included in the book. As well, Dr. Martin Schwartz is here, and he and I have traveled down the rural violence against women path. Done extensive writing and research together on this, and a special thanks go to Amanda Hall Sanchez, who was heavily involved in our rural Southeast Ohio study. And of course, Joe Dodemeyer, who's here and is a major pioneer in the field of rural criminology and has showed me the way in many ways, many different ways of knowing. Special thanks must also go to Sandra Walklade, who years ago, back in 1990, introduced me to critical victimology, and I've taken that route many times too. And of course, Jim Petacek, special thanks to him, who I think I've eaten up many hours of his time, his valuable time, talking about Liz Kelly's Continuum of Sexual Violence, which has heavily shaped this book. And of course, Sarah Wendt introducing me years ago to Australian literature. And last but not certainly least, Claire Renzetti, her influence on me is multifaceted. But I have to say that she's played a very important role in bringing us to where we are today, because she had this incredible series with SAGE, the Violence Against Women series. And one of the most important books in the field came out of that series, and that was Neil Websdale's book on rural women battering, which still stands the test of time. It really does. I mean, my copy is dog-eared and filled with margin notes and so on. And he's cited quite liberally in this book. Of course, Jane Mooney wrote the foreword, and I deeply appreciate her insight, not only about the book, but also many other facets of violence against women. So turning to the book, this book chronicles contemporary developments in the study, mainly the sociological study of violence against women in rural and remote places. Now, it is definitely not a dry recitation of the extant literature. Of course, I do cite the literature, but more importantly, I wanted to extend research and theoretical work on violence against women in rural places to focus on not only acts of interpersonal violence that exist on Kelly's Continuum of Sexual Violence, but also crimes of the powerful, such as the poisoning of farm workers, female farm workers, the sexual harassment of female farm workers, genocidal rape, and other crimes committed during the course of war against women. So I call the continuum, I took Kelly's continuum and I modified it, I call it the continuum of woman abuse. And it ranges from, non-physical acts such as image-based sexual abuse all the way to crimes of the powerful. And following Kelly, I do not argue that any particular behavior that exists on the continuum is more serious than the other. And I argue that the behaviors actually seep into each other. An example of this is Skye Saunders' research in Australia. She's done some fantastic work on the sexual harassment of women in rural communities and rural workplaces. And she describes an incident in which a female minor is repeatedly sexually harassed, and then eventually one of her coworkers rapes her. And so you can see how certain behaviors merge into each other and seep into each other. And though that I think is one of the most important features of the book, to start thinking more broadly, moving out of the realm of just private violence, which is obviously very, very important, but we should also examine crimes of the powerful. Chapter 1 focuses on controversies in defining the concept rural and the concept of woman abuse. And of course, there is no uniform definition of rural, and perhaps that's a good thing. I prefer the term woman abuse. I know a lot of people are now using the term intimate partner violence, which I fundamentally oppose, because years ago, starting with Bryans and Gordon, their famous article in the journal Signs, they said that this term, these gender neutral terms like IPV, suggest that women and men are equally violent, and this is not the case. Now, some people say, well, IPV is good because it's inclusive, but I think we should use terms, if we're talking about violence in LGBTQ communities, we should be saying, violence in lesbian relationships, violence in gay relationships, and so on and so forth, because the gender neutral terminology is also used extensively by men's rights groups and fathers' rights groups. And I think it does a lot more harm than good. That's just my opinion. And I know that will be subject to much debate. I'm also concerned with advancing theory. If you look at rural criminology, Joe Donnemeyer points this out repeatedly, and rightfully so, rural criminology in general is stuck in a quagmire of relying heavily on place-based theories such as social disorganization theory. I'm trying to move it in critical directions, as are other people who have joined us. And there's you will see feminist theoretical work in chapter 3, theoretical work on interpersonal violence, heavily influenced by radical feminist ways of knowing, as well as theoretical work on male peer support, attachments to male peers, and the resources they provide that encourage and justify woman abuse. Then when we look at crimes of the powerful, I revisit some interesting theoretical debates that were actually very exciting in the mid-'80s. And I revisit instrumental Marxism and structural Marxism, and contend that these are useful theoretical perspectives that help us understand crimes of the powerful against women in rural and remote places. Finally, move into answering the question, what is to be done about violence or woman abuse in rural and remote places? One of the most important questions that we can consider. And I won't get into all of the policies that I proposed, but some of them include all women police stations, taking a human rights approach to understanding violence against women in rural and remote places, heavily influenced by left realist ways of knowing. In other words, I call for broader structural changes, this transition from a capitalist, patriarchal, racist, heteronormative society to one that is truly equitable on all levels. But that's not going to happen in the near future. So left realism contends that we need to have short-term progressive policies that chip away at broader structural forces that cause us much pain and suffering. So that's basically the book in a nutshell. I'd rather leave more time for my colleagues to provide their insight and time for the audience to ask questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction of the book. Next, I think we're going to the introduction series. So we'll go through Dr. James Potacek first.
Okay, thank you. It's just a big bunch of fun for me to be here. I'm on a panel with scholars whose work is just very powerful and has influenced me, people who I see myself in league with, people who have been my teachers. And to do this on such a rich and provocative book is really a kind of a joy. I've had many conversations with Walter over the years, and including about this book in particular. So I have some just thoughts on the book itself, and then thoughts on expanding the analysis in the book along the lines of what Walter himself suggests in the book. It's obviously not a book that is meant to be encyclopedic or comprehensive, but rather a book that means to be a provocative synthesis of feminist and critical criminological ideas. It means to spark conversation about theory, about methods, and even about terminology used to talk about women abuse. So let me first begin by talking a bit about the term patriarchy, which is emphasized in the book. Now, this is a term that Walter points out has fallen out of favor in journal articles and in a lot of academic discussion when talking about women abuse or violence against women. Critics of this term have said that the term patriarchy oversimplifies the idea of gender inequality, that it suggests a universal and unchanging type of societal power, and that it fails to address multiple inequalities and therefore differences between men and women based on issues like race and culture. Now, I want to suggest that these are powerful and important criticisms of this term. Nonetheless, there are scholars who are using this term in a very careful and critical fashion. Patriarchy is important to the work of Raewyn Connell and her important work on masculinities, and in her work with Rebecca Pierce on gender. Patriarchy has been important in Walter's work, in the work of the Dobashes, in the work of Hilary Potter. It's worth noting that a number of Black feminists use this concept in connection with intersectionality. I'm thinking here about the author Bell Hooks, the sociologist Patricia Hill Collins, the legal scholar Angela Harris, also the sociologist Beth Ritchie. They all use this term in critical kinds of ways. So even though it's not much used in journals, we have this legacy among critical scholars. I want to point out that I think that there's evidence that this term is being used more and more by feminist activists. If you look at the number of articles appearing in the New York Times containing the word patriarchy, there's evidence that there is an increase in usage of this term. Using the New York Times archive search engine in 2020, there were over 4 times as many articles using the word patriarchy in 2020 than there were 10 years ago in 2010. I think that the Me Too movement obviously has something to do with this. Walter's book shows a very careful use of this term, one that does not oversimplify gender inequality, one that does not see it as something that's unchanging, and one that is very much tied to multiple inequalities. So rural patriarchy is used to discuss in combination with racism, colonialism, economic strain, and globalization. He puts this in the context of the pornography industry, resource extraction in terms of like logging and mining, and the failures of state intervention, along with corporate crimes. So when used this way, I believe this term is really an opening for research and analysis. If we really want to do intersectional work, we need the term patriarchy, and we need a theory of this term in order to really expose how it interconnects with other forms of inequality. And I think Walter really advances this conversation with his development of rural patriarchy. His term rural is also very thoughtful and critical. He notes that this is a very difficult term to pin down, but my sense is, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, is that he wants to say that rural is much more than an administrative definition, much more than a variable in a quantitative analysis, much more than just merely a description of a geographic region. Mindful that there are many differences among rural communities in North America and around the world, I believe he means to establish rural as a dimension of social disadvantage, a social disadvantage in a social, cultural, political, and economic kind of sense. A social sense in terms of arguing that geographic isolation, inadequate transportation, and a lack of social services, along with precarious housing arrangements, really contribute to women abuse in rural communities. It's cultural in the sense, as he puts it, that communities in rural areas share a larger core of values than is true of people in urban areas. And he means by this an acceptance of firearms, hypermasculinity, and substance abuse, all of which contribute to rural abuse. It's a political term affected by development plans made by politicians and businesses concerning farming, mining, and logging. He doesn't mention this, but it also extends to the building of prisons in rural areas, which I'll get to. And it's obviously an economic term in terms of the economic transformations going on in rural communities about the decline of family farming and changes in resource extraction. This poses challenges to traditional forms of masculinity, which also contributes to women abuse. It also contributes to what are called deaths of despair, suicide, alcoholism, and drug use, which are rising in urban areas also, something Walter and I have talked about. This leaves us with profound differences in victimization rates between rural and urban areas. Rural women are more likely to be killed, according to his analysis. Canadian Indigenous women, many of whom live in rural communities, are more likely to be killed than non-Indigenous women. Canadian Indigenous women are 5 times more likely to experience violence against women. Domestic homicides involving firearms are higher in rural communities. There's many other factors that he develops in showing the power of this as really a dimension of social disadvantage. I'm going to just add a couple things and expand on what he's saying here. He talks about the rates of violence in Indigenous communities in Australia and Canada. It's worth noting that, of course, research in Native American women's communities show equally horrific levels of violence. A 2016 report by the National Institute of Justice found, if you can believe this, 83% of American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence over their lifetimes. 55% of the women in the survey reported violence from an intimate partner. 56% reported sexual violence in the survey. And more than a third of these women were unable to obtain the necessary resources in the wake of this victimization. In his book, he talks a lot about boom towns, and he mentions boom towns in the Bakken oil region of Montana and North Dakota, which contribute to women abuse. What isn't mentioned is that the Bakken region lies near a number of Native American tribes. During the peak of oil production there, thousands of oil workers came to live in boom towns. There was an increase in sexual assault, sex trafficking, missing women, and the murder of women in the surrounding tribal communities. Unlike other groups, the victimization of Native American women often involves non-Native offenders, and the location of these communities near boom towns may give us some insight about some of this. Now, one of the things that he provokes in his conversation is that there needs to be a wider use of intersectional analysis in rural criminology. He says that intersectionality is front and center in almost all the contemporary North American feminist literature on the violent experiences of inner city African-American girls and women, but it is yet to gain momentum in the theoretical work on women abuse in rural and remote areas. I'd like to expand on this in 2 ways, talking about how there should be a convergence between rural criminology and intersectional feminism on the issues of police killings and rural prisons. From the perspective of feminist scholars of color, these both represent sites of what they call enforcement violence, which is a way of naming a special kind of state violence. This is violence by police and guards in prisons and jails, violence by the Border Patrol, and by immigration agents. You may be interested to know that a recent report by the Vera Institute of Justice finds that between 2013 and 2019, the number of people killed by police per capita decreased in urban areas by 22%. But over the same time, between 2013 and 2019, it increased in rural areas by 26%. It's important to note that many women are victims of police killings as documented by Andrea Ritchie in her important book, Invisible No More: Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. The police killings of 98 Black women are listed on the website Say Her Name, created by the African American Policy Forum. Now, some have speculated that the decrease in police killings in urban areas may be the result of protests and pressure that is not prevalent in rural areas. Police shootings have declined in Philadelphia, San Francisco, and Baltimore after the cities reformed their use of force policies. But what's going on in rural areas? This seems like an important issue to follow for rural criminologists. How might racism and patriarchy be related to an increase of police killings in rural communities? The second issue I want to just briefly address, involving a convergence between rural criminology and intersectional feminism, is the issue of rural prisons. In recent decades, most prisons have been built in rural areas. This has happened in many conservative southern states such as Oklahoma, Texas, Florida, and Georgia. This has been economically advantageous for rural communities and also advantageous for politicians looking to increase the populations in their communities, even though the prisoners can't vote. It's really a cynical way of building political power that can help in redistricting issues. The treatment of women in prisons in rural areas involves many violations of human rights. In one recent report, women prisoners are more likely than male inmates to experience physical and sexual abuse, serious mental illness, substance abuse problems, and suicidality. It seems that this represents an issue that should be of concern for scholars of rural women abuse. And even though Walter doesn't mention it, he did review an important book called Outlaw Women, Prisons, Rural Violence, and Poverty last year, and I think he may have something to say about this. All of which is to say that if his goal was to provoke new thinking, provoke critical thinking about these issues, I believe his book has really succeeded, and I'm really happy to have a chance to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Potacek, for your comments. Next, we'll move on to Dr. Sandra Wacklate.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Just to say, I think it's a real privilege to be sharing in this celebration and review of Walter's recent book. And it's a privilege to be sitting here in North Wales in a very rural area where my neighbours speak Welsh, and to be sitting here doing that and talking to you about rural woman abuse all at the same time. So I think my comments and review will have perhaps a different flavour to them as a consequence. I should also explain that, and this is my fault in terms of my little bio that we started with, the conjoint professorship phrase is that I'm actually a conjoint professorship with Monash University in Australia. So I'm kind of part-time based in Liverpool, I'm in the UK now, and I'm part-time working with colleagues at the Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre in Monash University in Australia, to which Walter also now has an affiliation. So yeah, as Walter mentioned, we were lucky to meet each other first in Vancouver in 1990. I still have the conference programme from that event that we were both speaking at. And it was a conference focused on radical left realism, as it was then termed, as a kind of emergent voice on the criminological scene. I was there offering some critique of left realism in the context of criminal victimization, to taking issue with how they understood the term real. And Walter was offering a left realist approach on woman abuse. And indeed, his focus then, as it is now, on challenging, expanding, and reasserting our understandings of woman abuse, informed by feminist theorizing of patriarchy, has not wavered in the intervening years. And I think that is really something to be commended, that whilst his theorizing has perhaps become more nuanced and more refined since 1990, he's certainly stuck to the assertion of the importance of patriarchy. And I think that's hugely valuable in this work. And that desire to stretch and challenge our understandings of woman abuse is evidence in this book. Okay. So taking a slightly different slant on reviewing Walter's work than we've perhaps heard so far. Interestingly for me, this book was my kind of work reading, if you like, at the same time as my leisure reading was a novel by an upcoming Australian crime writer, Jane Harper, named Jane Harper, a book called The Lost Man. Yes, I'm really boring. I read crime novels as a leisure activity as well as engage in criminological work as the main job. But it's really interesting how the two things kind of interweave with one another in some contexts. And in fact, I recently used one book by Jo Nesbo, this is a real aside, called Knife, to unpick assumptions about knife crime in the UK, but we perhaps won't go there too much. This particular novel is about sex crime and domestic murder in the Australian outback. That's the kind of rural community that to many urban dwellers, including academics, is just beyond our imagination. It really is, and until you've actually kind of physically felt the vastness of some of the places that are loosely called rural. They are very difficult to capture in words. But Walter's book, as does Harper's novel, renders such unimaginable places central to our criminological agenda. And it's absolutely key for us for all of us making claims on understanding the nature and extent of woman abuse, that we grasp that idea, that there is something really genuinely important to be learned by stretching our understandings of space and place. Walter's work, I think, makes a convincing case that the rural can no longer be considered a residual place. Yeah. His use of the term, the collective efficacy of the boys' club, patriarchy with local sensibilities, if you like, which I'm just combining two concepts that are really central, that I've taken to be central to this work, marked for me a remarkable synergy between reading Walter's book and reading Jane Harper's novel all at the same time. And that's what I mean about some things coming together and generating a life in a way that perhaps wouldn't otherwise have done so. It was a remarkable coming together of imaginings for me. So in a sense, that's a kind of plug to read Jane Harper's book if you want to know what I'm getting on about, but that's by the by. But I actually want to push Walter on two further questions, and he knows what these are because I sent him this little talk through yesterday, just in case my internet failed in any way, shape or form. And those two questions are the what is to be done question, I think, which has foxed us all for many years. And the second one is the what can we learn from the rural for the urban? Can we, how do we transpose that vision, if you like? For me, the collective efficacy of the boys' club underpins both questions. And it seems to me more timely than ever to confront each of them, as demonstrations in Australia in response to the Brittany Higgins allegations of sexual assault by a member of Parliament, and the response to the murder of Sarah Everard, for which a police officer is currently in custody in London, to name two recent events that have happened, and the massive public demonstrations by women that have ensued following on from those events, really makes it importantly timely that we take some of these questions very seriously indeed. But there's more to be said, in a sense. It's not just what those events visualize and render visible for us, it's what hides in the background too. So, for example, there has been a remarkable absence of similar outcries in the response to the murder and abuse of Indigenous women in Australia, and a remarkable silence around ethnic minority women who were murdered in the UK. And those silences are as telling as the public demonstrations, it seems to me. So in thinking about those questions and in thinking them through in terms of this moment and what ties them together, it seems to me that there's a tension here, not just for people who study woman abuse within criminology, but for criminologists, for criminology as a whole, and for all of us deeply concerned about violences against women. For me, that tension is manifested in the deep embrace of dichotomous thinking within the discipline, the either-orness of the global or the local, the urban or the rural, the northern or the southern. And actually, you know, what Walter's book does is bring all of those in the same conceptual plane, you know, because you get a flavor of that dichotomous thinking being challenged in his writings. But there are also some questions, some absences in that too. So, you know, where do huge swathes of China and India fit in our thinkings around some of these urban rural dimensions? Where does religion fit? Where do those societies fit who are still fundamentally patriarchal in structure, belief and values? Bangladesh comes to mind as an example. Recently advising a woman, a magistrate in Bangladesh who wants to do a PhD, and her sharing of the circumstances under which she's struggling to put her PhD proposal together so that her husband doesn't know are just incredibly touching. And this is a professional woman. So imagine the constraints of women living under different circumstances. So where do those communities fit within? Now, the further question I wanted to add to that is, if you like, is so where do the communities fit that exist like that in urban settings, whose rules and customs in the urban context and in places like the UK, where adherence to more traditional, arguably rural values still prevail and are still incredibly powerful. So, for example, reports from Southall Black Sisters during the last 12 months as COVID and lockdown has taken its toll on many societies. Southall Black Sisters report to the Home Office Home Affairs Committee that Asian women living in Asian communities in the UK would rather opt for suicide than face the shame of leaving an abusive partner, face the shame that would ensue from their families. So I think what we take from understanding the urban carries over into our thinking about, the rural carries over into our thinking about the urban too. That's perhaps at a local level. I think there are also some questions to be asked about the extent to which United Nations initiatives from the 1990s onwards in and around violence against women have helped or have they hindered women in these places, where we can actually trace the extent to which governments have pointed to adherence to United Nations goals, but it hasn't actually made any difference on the ground. You know, so there's a whole politics around what you do with that kind of knowledge and how you make progress in the light of that. So perhaps rather short and perhaps rather sweet and perhaps lots of questions. Well, I hope it was rather sweet anyway, but lots of questions, all made possible by the intervention of Walter's work, which for me encourages and stretches what space and place might mean when you live with men's violences. So, as I say, Walter's had a chance to think about some of that stuff because I sent it to him yesterday, but that's where I'd like to finish for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waglicht, for your comments. Next, we'll go for Dr. Callie Renison.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate being here and having the opportunity to read and think about this book. I think it's really going to be useful for researchers, but also as a really excellent teaching tool. And I appreciate the effort that Walter put into providing some of the information. I just want to hit on a few points and offer some questions to Walter to answer at his leisure. But I spend a lot of time thinking about definitions and measurement, probably more time than is normal, I suppose. But and as you clearly note in your book, it's essential to clearly name what one is talking about when it comes to research. I mean, I think that's something we all agree on. One of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about when we're talking about rural violence or rural, abuse in rural areas and things like this is that I often feel like we haven't done a good enough job saying it's one thing to talk about violence in a rural place, but do we also mean violence against a person who lives in a rural area, regardless of where the violence happens? Or is it violence in a rural area, regardless of where that victim or offender lives or spends time? And I just want to kind of throw that out there, that kind of question that I think I find in a lot of literature, including some that I've done myself. And I just wanted to pose that question to Walter and get his views. The second one, I wanted to talk a little bit about, Walter mentioned it, the definition of woman abuse. We've had a lot of fun in the papers we've written because I am a user of intimate partner violence and Walter hates it, as he's talked about. But the reason that I tend to use it is because woman abuse excludes girls. And so I wanted Walter to maybe give us some ideas of what are some terms we could use that aren't gender neutral, but don't exclude young, females without reducing them to females as a biological being. And also to say that I'm really so happy that this discussion's in the book too, because it's a great discussion to have with students. And the day we stop talking about it, I think is the day we're not paying attention. So I think it's a great discussion to have. We move down here in my notes a little bit more. I really loved the discussion of Liz Kelly's work on the continuum of woman abuse and appreciate what you've done with it to modify it. But one question that in a discussion I was having with somebody is that on your continuum, the rightmost category is called crimes of the powerful. And that raises the question of, aren't all crimes against women and girls crimes of powerful people? And how will you distinguish that? So that's a question I'd like you to maybe share your thoughts of in a little bit. And really, I mean, this book stretches the boundaries so many ways that I so appreciate, but really loved the discussion, although it was brief, on the medical abuse of women, especially those in rural areas. In fact, I searched the manuscript for, I think it was medical abuse is what I was looking for. And it was mentioned in an area about critical criminology in relationship to homicide. But this is an area that I think has been greatly overlooked. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on where we need to see this research go in the future. Coincidentally, as I'm reading and thinking about this, we're seeing the Johnson & Johnson shot pulled because of the 6 issues with women. And it just sort of is yet another highlight. I mean, we're pulling it, which I think is a great thing. But then if you look at the risk of stroke in birth control pills for women, that's 1 in 1,000. Yet that's an okay risk. And all of these things were just kind of in my mind. So I'd love to hear you think a little bit about that, your thoughts about it. And finally, where is it you think we need to go in terms of future quantitative research in this area? So I didn't provide a huge summary of the book. I think everybody else has done a great job of it, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think this book really has pushed the boundaries, and it's going to be an instant classic. So thank you, Walter.
Dr. DeCaire would like to address those questions later after all the critiques provider feedback. All right. The next one will be Dr. Sarah Wendt. As I mentioned earlier, Dr. Sarah Wendt is currently in Australia. Currently it's 2 a.m. It's a little bit brutal for her to staying up and to critique the book, but she's very kindly to send me a pre-filmed video, and I will be showing the video right now. As a routine, I will share my screen as a Zoom terminology nowadays. Can everyone see the screen I'm sharing?
Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Sarah Wendt, and I'm coming to you from South Australia, Adelaide. I would like to acknowledge that I'm actually on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Hello, James, Sandra, Carly, Claire, and particularly Walter. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel to talk about the wonderful book, Woman Abuse in Rural Places. Sorry I can't be with you live. Getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning and sitting up until 4 a.m. Was a bit of a stretch. But I hope that my comments are useful. And thank you again, Walter, for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about my thoughts regarding this important book. So I wanted to start by saying I found it absolutely wonderful and reassuring to state again the term and using the term woman abuse. And so Walter comes out really clearly stating that this book is primarily about woman abuse, therefore stating that it's violence committed by men and by male-dominated corporations and governments. And so to even start that off, you can see that Walter is political straight away, and I welcome that politics. I also particularly like that the book is set on a strong theoretical foundation, and I appreciate the engagement with the continuum of sexual violence, as again, this provides a really important theoretical backdrop and reminds us again that sexual violence and woman abuse is a broad array of painful interrelated behaviours that thousands of women experience daily. And so again, so you've got the term woman abuse, you've got the theoretical engagement with the continuum of sexual violence. And so yes, this book is political. Walter does not hide that politics. And so thank you, Walter. So this book again is about naming the reassertion of patriarchy and being on the side of women seeking peace, equality, justice, and a better quality of life. I also particularly appreciated Walter's engagement then with linking our understandings of violence against women to the structural understandings of our societies and our communities, so that this issue doesn't sit, alone with pathology or individuals. So the link to the structural explanations is always a welcome. I particularly found the importance of this political link in Walter's analysis of the journals that don't use feminism or don't use theoretical explanations around exploring this problem of woman abuse. And so the politics also in the difficulties of collecting data worldwide and how data lacks a sociological information and context. So for me, thank you, Walter, for bringing back and reminding us of the importance of the sociological information and context when we talk about an issue like women abuse. I have to say chapter 3 was one of my favourite because it's getting us to think theoretically. Here is where we explain, here's where we understand, contextualise and move beyond the statistics. And that's why we need sociologists, criminologists, social workers to be able to do this. This is where we can see possible change. So once you go to the theory, you can see how things are explained. You can then see options for what to do about it. And so, for example, you can see possible change when Walter talks about and names male peer support or neighbour non-intervention or rural norms of patriarchy and privacy. You begin to understand, but then not only do you understand and see the explanation, but that can then enable change. So theory allows us to move beyond the statistics or the limitations of statistics, gets us to explain and then think, what are we going to do about this in terms of structural change? I do want to also acknowledge that for me, one of the most important discussions, and I welcome much more discussion on this, is the advancement of intersectionality, particularly in this space. In the Australian context at the moment, we are having that discussion where our National Plan for Violence Prevention for Women and Children we take quite an intersectional lens, and that's only been recent. And so I think that the intersectional lens also is very important in understanding how we think about rural women. Who is the rural woman? Is it, you know, the big property owner who inherits? Is it the transient mobile families? Are we talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, small business owners, or are we talking about who the partner is? And so these questions all intersect with race, class, ethnicity, and the like. But also, I think we could, you know, continue to think about intersectionality and how we think about male peer support, and how that reinforces, you know, particular stereotypes or thinking around gender, race, class, ethnicity, and the like. So, for example, in some of my own recent studies in rural South Australia, it was very clear that women received quite different responses depending on who their partner was. So, for example, if her partner was a rich farmer, she might have, you know, friends who have material resources to support her, but she would be ignored or not believed because the stakes were too high for the community in terms of his resources and support. Similarly, I had women who were the partners of drug dealers and experienced horrendous forms of abuse, but because the community knew him and the response or the police response or the ambulance response was often slow because she maybe wasn't seen as particularly a valued member of the community, or this just happens in these circles. And so I think intersectionality also gives us something to think about in terms of who the perpetrator is, who defines perpetration, and who the rural woman is. And so intersectionality isn't only about people's lived experiences or identities. I think it shapes how we respond to issues as well. Thank you, Walter. I will continue to think about patriarchal social reorganisation. I particularly appreciate the challenge to keep moving male peer support theorisation further, and I believe in the push of intersectionality and the importance of feminism and sociology in this challenge. So for me, this was a great chapter about theory pushing us where to next. And then there is the next chapter, chapter 4, the crimes of the powerful. And in the very first pages, Walter talks about the state. And he raises the question about how the state facilitates crime. And on page 79, he states, developing new theories of the state that include gender, but it cannot be emphasised enough that sophisticated accounts of the state are essential because it is through the state that the position and the role of men and women and their relationships with society is defined, institutionalised and challenged. It does gender, the state does gender, and is a significant vehicle of sexual and gender oppression and regulation. And then he provides us with some wonderful examples of rural women's experiences of crimes of the powerful. I was so taken with this revisiting of the state, and if I was there with you, I'd love to ask you, Walter, what are the next steps and what can be done? You say that more can be said about the state. And so I would again revisit those kind of conversations about, you know, what do we mean by the state and the role of the state, and why it's actually important in this space of preventing and responding to violence against women. Though I do want to acknowledge that Walter does provide in his last chapter beautifully layered things that what can be done from legal through to male peer support, prevention and protection, economics and colonialism. So yes, he does reach to the products of patriarchy, capitalism, racism, ethnic conflict and so on. And so I want to end by saying it is the advancement of our intersectional theory in this space. It's using sociology to push our understandings, but also to re-engage at another level in this contemporary society about the state and what we think the role of the state is. So thank you for talking about violence against women through the lens of rural women, Walter, showing the complexity of their lives, but also reaching for and advocating for a conversation that returns to the cultural and the structural. And we see that throughout this whole book in terms of reaching for male peer support and, again, state. What a thought provoking, thorough take on the topic. The references are rich. This book is theoretically challenging and thought-provoking on where to next. Thank you, Walter. Have a great conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Wains. Comments, she said that she particularly filmed at 12 p.m. her local time to feel that physically present at the same time with today's panel as well. Next, we will have our final panelist, Claire Rezende.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this Author Meets Critics session. I feel like I'm at a party with friends. I see so many familiar faces. This is great. I'm really happy to be with you all today. I hope that soon we'll be able to get together in person and talk about these things. That would be nice. So the first round is on me. Write that down, and it's a promise, okay? And I'm really looking forward to it. I don't have a lot to add to the comments at this point. My colleagues have made some of the points that I wanted to make, which is, of course, always the fate of the last speaker, right? All the good stuff has already been said. But let me just say a few things, and then Walter can respond, and we can hear from the audience, which is always a great part of these sessions. First, I want to say that for me, Walter, one of the most important contributions of this book is that it brings together in one volume empirical work on the violent victimization of rural women that has largely been viewed as disparate literatures, right? So you can read about various forms of interpersonal violence against women, what the so-called private types of violence. But you have to, you can read about those in journals like the one I edited, Violence Against Women, but then you have to look elsewhere to a different set of literature, I guess, to talk about studies of corporate or government violence against women. And I guess this is also a plug for submissions. If you're doing this work, submit those manuscripts to Violence Against Women. It's important. But as Walter points out, there have been very few of these studies. They're few and far between. And so I thank you, Walter, for showing the connections across all of these different forms of violence, and for gathering all of these studies together in this one book. It's a tremendous service to feminist criminologists and to feminist scholarship. And like Jim, I also appreciate your efforts to clearly define rural, but more importantly, your emphasis on the fact that rural is not a homogeneous nor a purely demographic category, and for bringing attention to the diversity of rural places and cultures throughout the world. I live in Kentucky, and living in Kentucky, I often see and hear the stereotypes about rural places and people. And yet I know from my own observations and interactions how diverse the rural populations are in this one state alone. So drawing attention to rural diversity across regions in one country as well as across countries is a really significant contribution. And this brings me to my first question for you. One of the important things I've seen in Kentucky is a reappropriation of negative stereotypes by rural people themselves, so that, like other marginalized groups have done, they own and proudly redefine the stereotype in positive terms. So the labels hillbilly and hick, for example, are used pejoratively in mainstream culture, but there are individuals and groups in rural places who have taken these labels and redefined them positively and apply them to themselves as positive identity markers. Ashley Judd, for instance, whom you mentioned in your book, is one of these people. She's from Eastern Kentucky, and she proudly refers to herself when she introduces herself as a hillbilly, okay? And she uses this as a way to embrace and promote the culture and the identity. And in the book, you recount many very sad stories of rural woman abuse, often in the women's own words. But I'm wondering if you found during your research any instances of rural women using aspects of rural culture as tools of empowerment and as a way perhaps to redress or address violence and patriarchy in their communities. The victimization experiences presented in the book are wrenching, but I'm wondering if there are also grassroots efforts or movements for change and redress that you've come across, because I think these could be far more powerful and probably more successful than efforts by non-rural outsiders, so to speak, to come in and sort of save the day for rural women. So I'm just wondering about localized or grassroots efforts in this regard. And this brings me to my second question. I really appreciate the fact that you spend a chapter, the last chapter in the book, discussing practical answers to the question, what is to be done about the various forms of rural woman abuse that you examine in the other chapters in the book. Some of these, of course, are harder to implement than others, but throughout the book, you make mention of the tremendous anti-feminist backlash in the United States during the Trump administration, which was still in office when you were writing. So now we have a new president, right? One who, as a senator, was instrumental in the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, and as vice president played a significant role in improving enforcement of Title IX regulations. So I want to ask you, how optimistic are you that some of the changes that you propose can occur under this new administration? Do you think that now that we have this new president, that we have, for instance, a better chance of reversing some of the damage that the Trump administration did with regard to programs and policies to address violence against women? And finally, you mentioned the selective inattention to crimes of the powerful against rural women. But, I read that, I thought, well, has there been greater attention to the crimes of the powerful against urban women? Because I really think that there's been very little attention by criminologists to these crimes against all women, period. There have been a few studies of corporate crimes against women as consumers. I was thinking, for example, of the wonderful study that was done on the Dalkin Shield IUD that illustrated how corporate sexism intersected with racism and classism, because it was often poor minority women in public clinics who had the Dalkin Shield inserted for birth control. It was used very often with those women, and the tremendous harm that this did to those women. There was also, and actually there was an article in Violence Against Women a number of years ago on faulty breast implants that talked about, how cultural ideals of femininity and the objectification of women or women's body parts contributed to the development and marketing of these breast implants that broke and caused severe harm to women physically and psychologically, and even killed some women. But these studies are old now. They were done quite a while ago. So how do you recommend that we rectify this lack of attention to crimes of the powerful against women, not just rural women, but all women? You mentioned one of the problems is lack of funding for these types of studies. So going back to my previous question, do you think that there's any potential for change in this area under the Biden administration, under the new administration of the Department of Justice and the National Institute of Justice, Do you think it can become more progressive? And if not, how else do you propose that we might rectify this? So I think you have like about 40 questions to answer. So I'm going to turn this over to you, Walter. Again, thank you all for letting me join you. I can't wait to hear your responses, Walter.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Before I try to answer these questions, my mind's really buzzing. This is what these things should be, you know, good intellectual exchanges. There's so many incredible ideas that have emerged out of my colleagues' comments. I've scribbled down so many things. And now I feel compelled to rewrite the book, actually. I mean, there's so much incredible insight. Before I answer, I do want to mention Victoria Collins, who's here, and she played a very key role in working through issues that are discussed in the Crimes of the Powerful chapter. She's done some of the best work. She's one of the few people, actually, who has done work on the state crimes against women, and her book is so refreshing. I urge you to read this book for anyone who wants to get a good feminist analysis of the state and how it facilitates. Yes, there it is. Now, I'm going to start by answering Claire's questions, but I do want to say that talk about a commonality just very quickly. What all the my colleagues have in common is the emphasis on good theory, on theorizing. And, you know, this is because I think all of them have a rich, very rich sociological education. I mean, we were all, basically all of us, I think, were going to school at the same time. And in those days, all of our professors emphasized the importance of sophisticated theorizing. I do also want to throw a shout out to Gail Dines, because she's had a major influence on my work too, especially on pornography. And that's a good segue into, I'm going to start by answering Claire. With Crimes of the Powerful, Claire, I do talk a bit about, in chapter 4, pornography as a crime of the powerful. And it affects urban and rural women alike, and women of different ethnic cultural backgrounds, gender identities, and so on and so forth. But, you know, there is a literature, and you're correct to point out, a corporate crime literature that focuses on women as consumers and as employees, including in grocery stores and carpal tunnel syndrome and so on. And I was aware of it, and I'm not by any means defensive, but I was just trying to find if anything that was specifically focusing on the plight of rural women. And much of it, the research it focuses primarily on farm women and farm workers. And so we really need more Crimes of the Powerful research. And I think Victoria will talk a little bit about that later. There definitely is a need. There are very few people. And so if you were working in this area, yes, submit to Violence Against Women. Well, one question, Claire, that you've asked, do I think that the Biden administration will have a better response to the issues that are raised in this book? I think maybe somewhat with interpersonal violence against women. But I am a very strong fan of Ralph Miliband. And when I was writing this book, I revisited his pathbreaking monograph, The State in a Capitalist Society, which came out in 1969. And he makes an incredible point that's still relevant today. He reminds us that the state is a capitalist state. And he reminds us that, you know, in the UK, where Victoria's from, and some other participants, that Labour made more concessions to capital than the history of the Tories at the time he was writing his book. And I remember how grateful we were and, you know, excited about Barack Obama becoming president. And I was writing some material saying, don't be so optimistic, because it's still a capitalist state and it's still there to buttress the interests of capital. And if you look at Obama's campaign, it was so heavily funded by Wall Street. And I like Oliver Stone's documented history of the United States. And he does not pull anything. He shows that all the presidents since, World War II, regardless of their political stripes, have contributed to the accumulation of capital and really have paid lip service, I think, to the interests or the concerns or the inequalities experienced by different ethnic cultural groups as well as women. So no, Claire, I'm not really optimistic at all. I think it's the system we need to critique. And Elliot Curry and I, when we put together this volume on Trump, we were really concerned about people focusing so heavily on politicians' personalities rather than focusing on the system itself. And so I urge us all to revisit the state. I think it's fundamentally important, and critical criminology in general, and if you want to include feminism within critical criminology, has pretty much abandoned the state except for a handful of scholars like Victoria Collins. And I do think we should go back and revisit Marxist analysis of the state and maybe do some integrated theories of the state, which Victoria, I know, has been working on for a long time. The other thing, Claire, you talked about is the disparate literature. And I want to connect what you said with Sandra, because Sandra asked about other countries. Joe Donnemeyer had made this point in one of his recent articles that there's a missing literature out there. He talks about the big four countries, if you will, Canada, the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom. And the bulk of rural criminological knowledge is generated from these countries. But, there are rural communities all around the world, and there's got to be a literature there. And so I tried to find what I could. For example, Yountz et al. Study of rural woman abuse in Vietnam and other places. I had a wonderful research assistant, just an incredible person, and she was going into horticultural literature, agricultural literature, and so on. And Victoria was reminding me this. She said, no, you won't find much of this in crim. You're going to have to go outside. You're going to have to go into the human rights literature. You're going to have to go into political science literature. So your point on the disparate literature and looking outside our limited realm of criminology is fundamentally important. Commonalities. Yes, we know that not all rural communities are alike, but what I have found is they have a lot in common around the world. There may be language differences, there may be religious differences, but here are some of the commonalities. Patriarchy is one, as Sandra points out. You find it in other countries. Geographic isolation, social isolation, the absence of social services. In fact, this collective efficacy that goes both ways, the collective efficacy that functions to try to prevent public crimes, but simultaneously reproduces a very rigid gender hierarchy. Well, Hilda Jacobson's work in Tanzania shows that law enforcement functions to oppress women. There's work in other countries there. And so there are some commonalities. And getting back to Claire's point, what is to be done? I think we need a worldwide system, like to bringing these different rural communities together. And what do we have in common, and how do we struggle on a global level to enhance equality? As far as appropriating stereotypes go, I'm seeing this in West Virginia too, very much so. And this is the whitest state in the union, and it's now the second poorest state in the union. People feel, I think a lot of, in response to your question, I can't speak about Kentucky, but I think people feel very much abandoned. They feel abandoned by the Democrats, and they feel abandoned by the Republicans, and they feel abandoned by what people say here and in other places, East Coast and West Coast elites. And this reappropriating the stereotypes is a form of resistance. And I agree with that, with your interpretation of what's going on in Kentucky. This is happening here. As far as local, I did not spend as much time, or very little actually, in this book, but in the book Dangerous Exits that I wrote with Marty Schwartz, we do talk about local. And in rural Southeast Ohio, a good example is quilting. Many women who share abusive experiences come together and quilt. Art as well, art as a form of placemaking, to quote second generation septet scholars. Placemaking, art, pottery, these types of things where women are coming together and resisting. And art is a very important therapeutic mechanism. And, you know, Claire, horticulture, when I think about that, you know, in your work in that area, I think it's extremely important. In fact, I was very sad to hear from your colleague, Pat Mooney, that when I was visiting Claire's shop in 2012, I stayed in this nice little apartment complex, and behind it was a communal garden. And I saw, you know, families from other countries. They were foreign students or visiting faculty, and everyone was working in this garden together. And I thought this was so lovely, where, you know, people can communicate and share something like that. Okay, so I'll jump back. I want to get to Jim, and I think Jim and Gail Dines would both agree about the importance of the concept of patriarchy. I certainly do. This is how I ended up talking to Jim a lot in the past couple of years, because I thought maybe I'm losing it, my memory's going, or I'm not interpreting the literature properly, because I was seeing a conspicuous absence of thoughtful, sophisticated, theoretical literature on patriarchy. In fact, a conspicuous absence of sociological work. And if we always talk about the early research on violence against women that was heavily grounded in psychiatry and psychology, but then along come the 70s and the Dobashes and Susan Brown Miller and others who are our parents, and pushed the envelope and got us to think sociologically, and got us to think about the importance of patriarchy and the emphasis. I remember going to the ASC meetings. My first one was in 1985. And a lot of us were younger then, but there was theory in the air. There was theory at the sessions. We were always talking about theory and trying to design new theory and speculative theory. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for an article I published in 1988 in the Journal of Family Violence. It was my very first article. It was on the male peer support theory, and it was a middle range theory and speculative. You don't see that anymore. How many journals within the realm of violence publish speculative theory? Turning to Indigenous women, well, you know, the invisibility. In some countries, Indigenous people are more invisible than others. Canada, Indigenous people have suffered dearly, as they have in other parts of the world, but they're built into, some of their concerns are in the Constitution, but still there's a commission on disappearing women and murdered women. I know Australia, that's something else that brings us all together. A number of us who are on this panel today are influenced by Australian ways of thinking and have been to Australia and work with Australian people. But I think in the United States, Jim, Indigenous women are far more invisible than in other countries. I think, you know, Gail and I have talked about this. I think the discussion of race in this country has been basically centered primarily on people of color. There is talk now, of course, about hate crimes against Asian people in light of COVID, but there isn't as much discussion on Indigenous people. There isn't as much discussion on other, you know, people of other ethnic cultural backgrounds. Perhaps this is because of well, not perhaps, due in large part to the history of slavery here, and maybe in small part to America's emphasis on the melting pot, pushing us all to be the same. Whereas if you cross the border 4 hours from my house, it's an ethnic cultural mosaic. So there's some differences there. Now, Jim, on the point you talk about enforcement violence, Danielle Stoneberg, who's one of my doctoral students, this is one of her fundamental concerns. She talked about this in, Joe Donnemeyer was there too. We were talking about, with the International Society for the Study of Rural Crime, the searching of women in prisons, right? You know, the intrusion into their bodies. On the street, that would be considered, like, for example, if I grab somebody's breast here in West Virginia, that's sexual abuse in the first degree. That's under law, sexual abuse in the first degree. And I could face a $1,000 fine or possibly 5 years in prison. It never happens. You can just go into the nightclubs here and see what the frat boys do to the young women. And, you know, they're primarily exempt from the purview of law. But I think this is important. The research that we need to focus on now, broaden our definition of woman abuse to look at enforcement violence. I think this is really important. That's an incredible concept. I wrote it down, and I think I encourage my colleagues out there to focus on this. Let's look at this. It could fall under the rubric of state violence too, or state facilitated violence against women, which is a concept that Victoria has put out there, and it's an extremely useful one, right? And Victoria talks about too how the violence that goes on behind closed doors is facilitated by the state in many ways, by the way the societal reactions of the state to what goes on behind closed doors and on the street. What is Sandra? I want to turn to Sandra now. What is to be done? She asked the question, and there's a large literature on this. And I when I become cynical, I think we've all put together very much a wish list in light of the what they call the white lash in this country. You know, backlash, white lash. One thing I think we need to do is do a better job of answering the question, what is to be done about crimes of the powerful against women? This is an important question, obviously, because we know that, and I'm going to connect this with what Callie has to say. Yes, Callie, you're right. I never thought of it that way, that are all crimes against women that occur in the home or in the workplace or on the street, they're all crimes of the powerful. I think that's an incredible way of conceptualizing things. And I think in our further writings, we should talk about this. We should debate this and think about how we push these things forward. And this is what I love about today, because the conceptual and theoretical work that was presented by my colleagues is truly exciting and overwhelming. I mean, this is what we need. I'm hungry for it. I'm tired of abstracted empiricism. I really am. And, you know, Jock Young warned us about this in his last book, Where We Were Going in American Criminology. But we need to focus. I mean, there was a time, Sandra remembers this, you know, when we go back to left realism. Why did we have left realism? Well, critical criminology at that time was focused primarily on crimes at the top and ignored the plight of working class people. And that's why Thatcher and Reagan got into the fray, because the left abandoned the realities of what was going on in disenfranchised communities. Now, left realism was primarily an urban enterprise, although at the time, this person's name was Darrell Wood, who argued that left realism is very useful and appropriate to understanding working class crime in rural areas. So, you know, we got into this project of left realism, and we claimed, look, not all crimes on the street or in poor communities are moral panics, they're real. Of course, feminist scholars were pointing this out well before left realists were, about the, you know, the realities of women's experiences behind closed doors and on the street. And radical feminists, particularly from the UK, like Liz Kelly, Ruth Hall, remember her famous book, Ask Any Woman, Maynard, and all these people were doing, you know, this really cool stuff, and it's still relevant today. In fact, I love this expression that Liz Kelly has in Sandra's co-edited Handbook of Sexual Violence, where Liz Kelly correctly reminds us that the continuum of sexual violence stands the test of time. What can we learn from the rural? Sandra, this is a really good question, excellent question. And I think we need some articles on this because what has happened, sorry, and please tell me when my time's up, but what has happened is rural criminology historically has been pretty conservative. It wasn't until maybe around 2006 or so, you had Hogg and Carrington, and you had Marty and me and others coming in and challenging the place-based theoretical domination. People were taking urban theories like social disorganization and crassly applying them into rural areas. And Osgood and Chambers and people like that. So what has happened is historically rural has drawn from urban and urban has not drawn from rural. And there is a lot that can be taken from rural criminology to help us get a better understanding of urban. Our analyses of how collective efficacy goes both ways. Joe was doing this in Australia with the dark side of the mine shaft. I didn't know about that, while simultaneously Marty and I were doing this on the collective efficacy goes both ways in rural Southeast Ohio. So if you think about it, the first group of people to question the traditional collective efficacy came out of rural understandings of social problems. Now, one salient exception was Sudhir Venkatesh. In his book, The American Project, he questioned the legitimacy of mainstream collective efficacy. One thing we do know, we talk about police and what's going on in urban areas. Well, the Old Boys Network that Neil Websdale emphasizes in his path-breaking book. I mean, we can take from our understanding of how it's essential to break up the Old Boys Network, take that from our learnings in rural communities and apply that in urban areas. Why don't we call it an Old Boys Network in urban communities? Why don't we use that same terminology? Male peer support too, Sandra, in response to that. What I've learned after 35 years is that male peer support is ubiquitous. You find it in South Africa, Rachel Duke's work. You find it in Chicago, William Julius Wilson's work. You find it in St. Louis, Jody Miller's work. You find it in rural Southeast Ohio. You find it in Canadian public housing estates. You find it almost everywhere. It's ubiquitous. These sexist male networks, these guys are not isolated, very well connected. And there's certainly, you find them in fraternities, you certainly find them in college campuses. So I think there are some policies and procedures that we can think of that can be applied in both rural and urban areas. And I think when it comes to violence against women, what do we do about male peer support? I think it's that's one of the most powerful determinants of violence against women anywhere. Dichotomous thinking. Sandra, I'm glad you brought that up. And I know Joe was was nodding aggressively there because that's been one of his major concerns about, moving away from dichotomous thinking, north, south, rural, urban. I mean, and also this notion of social disorganization is there is no such thing as social disorganization. There's only social organization. And I think, it's time for Worth, Tonys, and Sampson, Earls, and Rodenbush to go away because it's not doing anything. It's not, these binary ways of thinking, especially from place-based theories. And this brings me to, Australians are doing excellent stuff on, Sandra talked about place and space. And I think about Bridget Harris's work. It's really incredible. Spaceless violence. So you have a place, but spaces are where we do ideology, where we have action, we have all these things. So what's the connection between place and space and also spacelessness? And what Bridget is doing right now is really important because, the digital divide is disappearing. Okay, it's still, the rural communities don't have the same access to Wi-Fi and other electronic technologies. But what Bridget is uncovering now is that many rural women are experiencing image-based sexual abuse and other digital forms of violence. And there's a co-occurrence, and Marty and I've been trying to bring the concept of poly-victimization, which is primarily used to explain child sexual abuse, into the realm of adults. And very few people are taking that concept of poly-victimization. And what poly-victimization, I think we need to understand, is the co-occurrence of offline and online forms of violence in rural communities. So this notion of place and space. Callie, you make a very good point. Were they victimized in rural places, or are they rural people who were victimized in urban? What I like about your point is, and it's connected to your other point about statistical work or quantitative work, the bulk of quantitative work on woman abuse has been caught up in examining geographic variations. Are the rates higher in rural, urban, or suburban? Stuck in that quagmire. And as Edwards points out, she has this piece in Trauma, Abuse, and Violence that we're missing. We're not looking at context, and we're not examining explanatory variables. And I have to say that based on a review of the literature internationally, work like Sarah Wendt, I mean, she's in the community, Skye Saunders, Bridget Harris. I mean, the best work on explanatory factors comes from qualitative research in the field. The quantitative is really stuck in just looking at regional differences. There's no testing of hypotheses, no testing of theories. The other thing that's really missing in the quantitative research is self-report work on men. Now, we have tons of stuff in the juvenile delinquency literature. You know, males are, you know, answering self-report surveys. The rural woman abuse literature, you don't see that. In fact, as Sarah has pointed out in 2016, and this is still going on to this day, there is a major absence of work on men. So Jim, your next project is to look at the dramas of masculinity among rural men, because we need that work. We really do. Now, this is not to say that we don't get rich understandings of what motivates men to be abusive by talking to women. I mean, who knows who are the leading experts about woman abuse? It's the women who live with these men and who experience these things on a day-to-day basis. But as Diana Scully pointed out many years ago in her book, Understanding Sexual Violence, we need to go into the minds of these men and see how they socially construct patriarchy and inequality. I've talked about what you had to say about crimes of the powerful. Girls, good point. Raquel Kennedy Bergen and Shanna Meyer make a very good point. They have a couple of contributions to handbooks that I co-edited. And we need to look at the experiences of adolescent girls and young girls in rural communities. There's a major absence of work in that field. In fact, there's a major absence of a lot of work that has a lot to do with gender. Child sexual abuse, would be very hard pressed to find research on child sexual abuse in rural communities. Sibling violence, elder abuse. These types of things warrant considerable attention. And they're all gendered too. These things are all gendered as well. So quantitatively, yeah, that's where we need to go. Get out of that, these are the difference between these places. Because Callie's point's correct. They may identify themselves as being rural, but were they actually victimized in rural places? Now, as far as girls go, Callie, you recall that you and I and Molly did that piece on girls' violence, girls' use of violence and variations across geographic places. Okay, Sarah and we'll end there and then throw it out to discussion. Sarah reminds us that we need to return to sociological ways of knowing. We really do. I'm really worried because especially here in the United States, people are doing a 3-paper PhD. And they're 3 articles and they get your PhD. And what they're doing, they're caught up in secondary data analysis. They're caught up in that. And, you know, Sean Gabadon and his colleagues were pointing this out in the Journal of Criminal Justice Education about 7 years ago. He was very worried. So the dissertation is no longer about new original research. It's about pushing students through. And so I find that students are going to these old data sets. Gabadon points out that much of the data that you're seeing in our 3 so-called premier journals, Criminology, Criminology and Public Policy, and Justice Quarterly, much of the data are 10 years old. And they're not telling us anything new. And they're taking theory and twisting it, like trying to take a square peg and putting it into a round hole. So we need to get back to sociological ways of knowing, because let's face it, who can best explain this? Of course, there's individual factors, but violence against women, it's estimated that, I mean, I read Sylvia Walby's book with about 800 co-authors, but she points out that, yeah, it's about 1 in 3 worldwide, 1 in 3. Now, you know, you don't have to be C. Wright Mills to figure out that, you know, we require sociological imagination to understand this. Intersectionality, yeah, we need more of that. And what's happening now, really quickly, you're going to see a changing terrain of rural communities, especially in North America, and I think in the UK and Germany, maybe in Australia, I'm not sure. But what's happening, major corporations are figuring out that they don't have to have people working in big buildings downtown. So you're seeing like states like Tennessee, where the housing prices have gone up, Tennessee's in Appalachia, and people are moving from California and so on. What am I saying here? What I'm saying is there's a false assumption that LGBTQ community members only live in urban areas. Let's face it, it doesn't matter what your gender identity is money in many ways, and employment's employment. And I'm reading these books like Queer Out in the Country and Queering the Countryside, which are challenging, you know, myths and showing that many people in LGBTQ communities are moving into rural areas because San Francisco, Toronto, Chicago, and New York are so expensive, but also they can work remotely now if they are in those privileged employment positions that allow them to work remotely. So I think we will have to have a better intersectional analysis. We will see changing demographics in rural communities. But she makes another very good point, intersectional links among societal reactions. You know, I think socialist feminists were starting to do this when they were looking at courtroom. Like if you're a lesbian woman of color, how are you treated by judges and other agents of social control? The intersectionality is really important. And the state, I want to conclude on this. I think we have to get back to the state. There's no doubt about it. I don't understand how, I think left realism had something to do with this, you know, although Jock would say if he was around with a square of crime, the square of crime does look at the state. But I think we need to revisit Catherine McKinnon. I mean, and her work, her radical feminist understandings of the state, going back to 1989, we need to build on that. So I want to end on that note and thank everyone for such a, you know, you guys should write articles on this, really.
Well, now we do have some time to open discussion with the participants on Zoom. Well, before that, I do want to acknowledge we have some comments from the participants earlier on. For example, I believe people mentioned about the patriarchal structure in Germany. And then also we talk about the Germany legalized prostitution, which has made it a hub for traffickers. They have a 6-story brothels where men pay a flat fee for all the women they can work their way through in a 24-hour period. Another question actually from a participant, she asked about, could you speak to how services for victims of rural women abuse currently function in rural places? What changes are most essential to create more accessible victim services in rural environments? I think you mentioned a little bit in previous comments, but do you want to add a little bit more?
Yeah, there's conspicuous absence of services. Take 6 miles from here is Pennsylvania. And what Pennsylvania does is services to survivors are based on absolute numbers rather than percentages. And we know that Pennsylvania rural women experience higher rates of sexual assault, but the state doesn't provide the number of resources that match those percentages. And people have to drive very long distances, and I mean, they're almost non-existent. I mean, in many communities, they're almost non-existent. And, you know, many rural people feel abandoned in many, many ways. And it's very difficult to leave. You know, you hear, well, how can you leave? Well, where are you going to go? And how are you going to get there? Because a car is not a luxury in a rural community by any means, in the absence of public transportation. Now, I have been reading about how some libraries are trying to, in a stealth fashion, rural libraries, lawyers are moving in there and providing services to abused women in private spaces in the library so their partners don't discover that. I include this in the book, but I'm not happy with the level of services. In West Virginia, there are some innovative things, though, that are happening. There's this group called Libera. And what they do is they have this bus, and in it, they have a fridge and other things, and they drive around. And there's a social worker, and there, you know, other people in there, and they'll park at a Walmart parking lot. And it's designed to empower women. So they come to the women, they drive long distances, and people like myself donate money to this. They don't advertise that they're, you know, dealing with abuse by any means. It's just about, you know, assisting women with all their rural women with all their struggles. I think that's a cutting edge, innovative way. So if they can't come to us, how do we get to them? So if a woman says to her husband, you know, who's an abusive husband, I'm just going down to Joe's Market, and says, okay, they may be there and she may have 5 or 10 minutes and get some information. I know as simple as it sounds, very simple, but it's in very, very much an innovative thing that can be done. The breaking up, what the women we interviewed repeatedly talked about is breaking up the old boys network. Now, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, I'm not saying that they're immune from criticism. In fact, there's a considerable amount of sexual harassment within the RCMP, and there's a report. But they have a policy. You cannot spend more than 3 years in a community. They rotate you. Now, that's good and it's bad. It's bad for, say you have a family with roots in the community and so on, and you're uprooting people and there's instability. On the other hand, it precludes people from developing very strong ties with abusive men, because we do know that many of the men who are abusive have friends in the criminal justice system. In fact, yeah, so things haven't really gotten that much better. Maybe with the internet, we might see some improvements, but it's still, we have a long way to go.
Thank you so much. Now we are opening up the Q&A session for everyone. If you would like to unmute yourself, make comments, ask questions, please do so as well.
I have a question. Thank you. Thank you, Walter, and everyone for that great presentation. I was taking notes as you were talking and talked about like patriarchy and intersectionality. Now I put something in the chat here that as we kind of move away from a Marxist informed radical feminism, we get into the notion of gender fluidity. And what we lose there is the material reality of women as a subordinate sex class that you can't define your way out of. So what concerns me is, again, moving away from the term violence against male violence against women to gender-based violence, which again loses the political edge of what's going on. And just the whole notion that somehow we're individuals with free-floating identities that can be changed as we wish. And the concern for me is how violence against women gets affected by this, and the idea that this is not that we don't see violence much more as a structural reality of patriarchy that is built into it, but just a kind of individual problem that a woman has to deal with, which we know is not true.
No, I agree with you, and that's why I prefer the term woman abuse. However, I think that if we were talking about, say, violence against trans women or trans men, call it that. Call it violence, against lesbian women. Specificity, I think, is really important. Now, the criticisms, I'm well aware of them, and people have accused me of saying you're not being inclusive and so on and so forth. But the reality that I've faced and you've faced and other people have faced who have started off years ago in the struggle is that this push to degender the topic. Even VAWA in this country, the Violence Against Women Act, what the fathers' rights groups managed to do is put an asterisk in VAWA, which was designed to respond to the criminal justice system's disregard for violence against women. They put an asterisk in there that men are victims too. And what I see is that there are well-meaning people who use IPV for well-meaning reasons. I'm not saying that they're automatically the enemy by any means. But what happens, the reality is you've got a lot of very conservative, anti-feminist people who use that language and who are, very rabidly intent on pushing back all the things that we've struggled for, for the last 40 years. So I've repeatedly heard the term TERF, as you have too, Gail, and the assumption that radical feminists are hostile to trans people, which is, there may be some. I don't hang out with them, so I don't know. But certainly I haven't heard you say that. In fact, many people are deeply concerned in porn studies about the objectification and degradation of trans people and of people of different gender identities. So I think what we need to do is have multiple types of definitions, but let's not forget, as Bob Pease points out in his new book, Facing Patriarchy, Bob has done a lot of very good work on the grassroots and academically in Australia, that who are the primary victims of violence, gender violence. And so that's why I prefer that type of language, but have different sets of definitions for other groups of people.
I would like to say something. I have to go very quickly, but I just wanted to thank everyone for letting me come and join in and listen. And thank you, Walter. It was a wonderful book. What I particularly liked about it is that how you talk about, revisit the topic of patriarchy as a theoretical lens, and also connect it to capitalism, which in my work and things that I like to think about is how patriarchy and capitalism is then inevitably related to corporations in the state, right? So, and it makes me think about sweatshop industry and how that's very gendered, and the migrant workers that move from the rural to the urban to provide money for the home, the family at home in the rural, and how it's all very symbiotic, right? So to me, it made me start thinking about some of those things, and has inspired me to start thinking about sort of space and place in some of my work. But I just want to thank you all, and I have to go, and I hate to be that person, but thanks ever so much, and it's been lovely being here.
Bye, thank you.
I'm sorry, I was just going to ask a really quick question if there's time. And I don't know if there's something to this, but one of the things I've always found puzzling is the way that we do a lot of our research of violence against women based on how, say, a victim self-identifies themselves, or violence against a Black person. And maybe there's something to thinking about, instead of thinking about how the person identifies, but how society sees the person, because that's society responds to us that way. And I don't know if there's something to be gained by thinking about that in terms of these definitions, Walter. What do you think? I hope that made sense. It was hard to articulate.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, that how societal response, society or, social services, or they respond according to how they define you.
Mm-hmm.
are you the ideal victim? So for example, if you were sexually assaulted, as you know, you've worked in this area for a long time, by a fraternity boy at a fraternity party, you're not really a victim. The ideal victim is a married woman walking down the street in broad daylight, and a man jumps from behind the bushes and attacks her. And so, yeah, I think your point is very well taken. And I understand that people who are at the margins are upset because they claim that their voices aren't being heard, not only by, law enforcement and service providers, but by academics as well. But it's a real challenge.
Thank
And
you.
who is the ideal victim, really? Who's the ideal survivor? I think Niels Christie's question is still relevant today.
I think it's almost 2 p.m. That is our official time for the panel discussion. I just want to quickly give a conclusion in terms of thanks for the panelists and the participants today here to engage in such great topic. This probably is the best author meets critiques ever attended. So I'm so glad I'm even a host and a moderator here. Officially, I think I will stop the recording.